Eu queria agradecer. Bom, eu sou o Tiago Falcão. Aqui do meu lado tem o professor Ivan Musso. Vou pedir para o Ivan vir para cá. Vem para cá, venha. Eu e Ivan coordenamos o Laboratório de Pesquisa em Mídia, Entretenimento e Sociedade, do Departamento de Mídias Digitais, oficialmente também do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Comunicação da UFPB. E, na verdade, a gente pensou ali no final do ano passado em fazer um evento e fomos agraciados com a possibilidade de trazer um pesquisador internacional. Então, tem uma rodada de agradecimentos que eu gostaria de fazer antes da gente começar e passar a palavra para o Jamie Woodcock. Então, a gente foi realmente agraciado porque o meu chefe de departamento, o professor Kleber, ele me perguntou se a gente tinha alguém que a gente quisesse, que a gente queria trazer, e, bom, o próprio Jamie falou ontem, assim, quando você recebe uma proposta como essa, você nunca disse que não, né? Você disse, não, eu tenho quem trazer, sempre. E aí estamos aqui hoje, assim, fico muito feliz com todos os amigos queridos que estão aqui para falar e para discutir com a gente, com as pessoas que eu também não conheço e que vou ver seus trabalhos. Então, obrigado a todos. Eu tenho uma lista aqui de gente para agradecer oficialmente. Só um segundo. Então, queria agradecer ao CCHLA, na figura do professor Rodrigo Freire e do Marcelo Sitkovski, que são os diretor e vice-diretor. Também ao Tiago, que é o secretário, assim, são sempre excelentes conosco. O professor Kleber, o Demid e a Bitweek. Isso é importante, porque o PowerPlay é um evento que só é possível por causa da Bitweek, que é a Semana de Ciência e Tecnologia do Departamento de Mídias Digitais. Então, assim, muito obrigado aos queridos técnicos que estão ajudando a gente sempre, a CAPES do CNPq, vocês sabem, né, pelo apoio financeiro, aos nossos bolsistas, sobretudo Anderson, Kenneth e Alexander, que trabalharam arduamente para que isso aqui pudesse acontecer, ao grupo de pesquisa como um todo, Lens, aos meus queridos amigos e palestrantes, Tiago, Gabi, Ariane, Emmanuel e Marcel. E é isso, já falei que esse evento é uma promoção do Laboratório. Muito obrigado, eu vou passar a palavra agora para o professor Jamie Woodcock, que é professor da Universidade de Essex e autor do livro Marx no Fliperama, além de outros livros, tem um largo trabalho em sociologia do trabalho, pensando indústria, pensando relações, pensando precarização e plataformas. Tá? Então, sem muito mais delongas, I'm gonna hand the mic to you. So thank you for being here. And
thank you very much. And thank you for the introduction. Although, as you can probably now tell, I don't speak Portuguese, so I have no idea what the introduction said, but I'm sure it was lovely. Thank you to Tiago and Ivan and the rest of the university here for inviting me. I want to say it's really lovely to come and speak in Brazil, in part because it's snowing in London right now. We're having a cold snap, but also because my stepmother is from Pernambuco, so it's very nice to come to this part of Brazil, and she's always very proud that I've had books translated into Portuguese. So it's definitely, it's won me some points with my stepmother, which is always a nice thing to have. What I'm going to talk about today is Marxism and video games, and mainly some of the ideas from the book that was translated into Portuguese. And I'm also going to give a few more updates from things that have happened, because Marx at the Arcade was one of those incredibly frustrating books to write, because the moment the draft was finished, something new happened. And then the moment it went to being copy edited, loads of new things had happened. And so by now the landscape has moved on, lots of exciting things have happened. And so I want to talk through some of the ideas and themes from the book, and then a bit of the kind of current research that I've been doing. But I guess the first thing to say, which I guess is one of the things that, my boss asked me, or, other people in my universities. Well, why write about Marxism and video games? Maybe to some of you in the audience, these seem like two things that could be combined, we could think through. But to many Marxists, video games are something quite flippant, something that you play with, not something where you go and organize or talk about politics. And similarly, you might be aware that there is a certain controversy with Marxism within video games culture. So not often are these two things brought together. But in part, I wrote this because, unless it's not obvious already, because I'm a Marxist and I wanted to try and understand the video games industry, but also because I wanted to spend some more time at work playing video games. And this was the kind of, a gambit to spend some time at work doing this. But I also want to introduce a quote that's at the start of the book from Stuart Hall. And I don't know how familiar people in Brazil are with Stuart Hall's work. Maybe some of it's been translated. Okay. Because this really, for me, summarizes why we should do projects like this, why we should talk about popular culture. Because as Stuart Hall says, popular culture is one of the sites where a struggle for and against a culture of the powerful is engaged. It is also the stake to be won or lost in that struggle. It is the arena of consent and resistance, partly where hegemony arises and where it is secured. It is not a sphere where socialism or socialist culture, already fully formed, might simply be expressed, but it is one of the places where socialism might be constituted. And that is why popular culture matters. Otherwise, as Stuart Hall continues, to tell you the truth, I couldn't give a damn about it. And so, of course, I'm interested in popular culture. I'm interested in trying to understand video games, but for a very particular reason. To understand the politics and the power behind it, to talk a bit to the theme of the conference. To think about what power relations happen there, what forms of resistance emerge to it, and what this can tell us about capitalism more widely. And probably speaking to an audience like this, I don't need to tell you that video games are now a mainstream phenomenon. And one of the estimates, and of course we should always be very suspicious of things like Statista and these sorts of statistics, but that approximately half of the world population now play video games on a semi-regular or regular basis. So video games have become mainstream popular culture. And one of the things I quite like about these statistics is there's a peak. It slightly goes down again in terms of the number of people playing. And this was during the pandemic. Huge numbers of people, particularly in the global north, suddenly working from home and discovering that they could play video games instead of sending emails and doing Excel spreadsheets and these sorts of things. So there's a kind of moment of joy in these statistics of people getting to do something different. And also, and I realize it could be quite revealing, putting my own Steam page up on the slides and seeing what I've been playing and what I haven't. But the reason I do this is to say that this is now an arena of popular culture in which there is a huge overproduction of games. At the latest count, Steam has over 77,000 unique games. This is a huge range of popular culture being produced, which of course doesn't even take into account other platforms that have games that are not released on Steam. So we're talking about a kind of wealth of culture being produced, perhaps. And so what I wanted to do was to try and make sense of what's happening in the games industry, and to have a side mission to play video games at work, which was semi-successful. There was some playing video games at work. But it was also started mainly because I met some video game workers who were starting to organize. And we started having discussions about what was happening in the video games industry and the sorts of changes that were taking place. And I want to start by talking about Assassin's Creed. How many people here have played Assassin's Creed? Okay, so we're familiar a bit with the game. So the first bit of video game research I did was to play through Assassin's Creed Syndicate. And, I like this game in part because a lot of the settings are within walking distance of where I live in London. So you can kind of go back in time and see that Whitechapel has changed a bit in some ways and not changed in others, and you can, do all manner of things. I also played it because I knew Marx was in the video game. And I got, of course, excited about meeting Marx in a video game. Played through, met this guy with a beard. It's like, this is fantastic. I've met Marx. Turned out to be Darwin, which was a slightly kind of disappointing moment. And then played through a bit further to find Marx. And you do a number of missions for Marx in the video game. You help Marx avoid the police. This is, of course, something he did a bit of in London. You help him get to a meeting on time, something he probably never did when he was living in London, if you know much about Marx's history. But there's one mission in particular, and I promise there's a political point coming here rather than just talking about finding a virtual Marx, is in one of the missions that you play for Marx, he asks you to do something quite strange. So you meet him outside of a factory, and he says, I really want to know what's happening inside this factory. I want to know what the conditions are like. I want to know, are these people being underpaid? And so, of course, it's Assassin's Creed, so you jump in through a window, you assassinate some guards, you set fire to some things, and then you steal some factory reports, and you bring these out to Marx. Now, of course, this game takes some creativity with history, right? Marx didn't have twin assassins to follow him around and so on. Well, as far as we know, he didn't. There's, of course, this kind of strange Templar history that runs through the game and so on. So I'm not saying that this is entirely accurate, but what we do know is that Marx did have a great interest in factory reports. Other than the story we see here, what he really did was spent a very long time in the British Library reading factory reports, because he was particularly interested, after writing Capital, of trying to understand how the dynamics of capital related to real lived working conditions of people in factories. And so I like to imagine that somewhere somebody was writing this story and said, you can't make sense of Marx without this history of workers' inquiry, without this history of factory reports. I mean, maybe this is the case, maybe it's not. But what it left me thinking about is, what would it mean to do an inquiry in the way that Marx began to think about this towards the end of his life into the video games industry? What kinds of questions would we ask about working conditions? Where would we find the factory reports? How would we start to uncover what was happening in this industry? And so what Marx does towards the end of his life in about 1880 is, having read many of these factory reports, which of course were not written by people who were that enthusiastic about workers having more power or more say over their work. They were documenting what they saw as kind of moral outrages or moral problems. Marx took it upon himself to write a survey. How many of you are quantitative researchers? Anybody have any training in quants? Marx wrote a survey that had 101 questions that he would send to factory workers. Now, if you have any quants training, this is a terrible idea. Getting 4 or 5 questions answered is usually quite difficult. 101 is really quite remarkable. But what he actually wanted, and he puts at the end, is he said, answer these questions if you want to. If you don't, send me a letter. We can have a talk about what's happening in your factory. And he started trying to use these investigations to understand what was happening, mainly in the textile industry, in the coal industry, and starting to try and politicize a form of research to understand how it could help us understand capitalism today. And in general, this bit of history is usually reserved to a footnote. Marx did something a bit strange towards the end of his life. He started sending out surveys. And why I find the Assassin's Creed version so interesting, to see this this part of Marx in the game is because there's also a strain of Marxism that emerges from this questionnaire, a way of thinking about work and a way of trying to do research that's become known as workers' inquiry. And my PhD student, who is clearly overperforming, wrote a book last year alongside his PhD, because the pressure for academic work in Britain is increasingly high, where he found responses to Marx's original survey, that this was used by people, that coal miners in Germany used the survey, tried to understand their conditions, sent these to Marx. And it was a kind of moment of Marx reaching out to different groups and saying, you have something to say about your work, and it's politically important, and trying to encourage these things to happen. And so Clark, in his recent book, has pulled together a whole series of responses to Marx's inquiry, as well as translations. And I think I'm right in saying Marx's original inquiry was translated into Portuguese in the 70s, used in both in Brazil and in Portugal. And when it was first translated, both the translators were arrested because they said this is a risk. Letting people go around talking to workers and learning from their experiences is a dangerous thing to do. So anyone who's doing translation, that's the bar to go for, right? You translate something and then immediately get arrested for doing it. And in part, it influenced a number of studies in this region and in Pernambuco around cane sugar production. Robert Linhart, French Maoist intellectual, spent time doing inquiries in France and then later came to Brazil and spent time interviewing cane sugar workers and talking to them about their conditions. So the point that I'm trying to get to here is that there is a methodology, a political methodology, that emerges out of this moment of Marx, that is about saying you can do research alongside organizing, and to not set up the researcher as an expert and the worker as a subject, but to find ways to try and combine the two. And we see this in this early moment of Marx, and bizarrely in a bit of Assassin's Creed, which is an interesting moment. So what does this have to do with play? And I also realized there are meant to be titles on the slide, so I'll just guess what I put there and say, I think this one was probably what do we make of play? And in a way, workers' inquiry doesn't help us to make sense of play. If we talk to people about their work and working conditions, it's rare that these questions would be about what do you do after work, or what kinds of activities do you enjoy doing? And so this, of course, won't be a surprise to some of you in the audience who researched this already, but play is both an interesting and difficult concept to try and make sense of under capitalism. Play, by its very nature, is an unproductive activity. And in the wake of the neoliberal restructuring of effectively all of our lives, or large parts of it, we're constantly told about the virtue of work. I don't know about students here at this university, but my students are constantly being told, how are you making your CV stronger? What experience are you gaining? What are your activities feeding into your job market prospects? This kind of constant pressure to be thinking about work all of the time. And then when we're not doing any work, worrying about it and preparing for it at every moment. And so in that context, the idea of spending a whole afternoon playing video games feels like an unusual one for the kind of subjectivity that's being pushed upon people. You could be reading a self-help book or listening to an audio book about pop psychology or something else, right? There are self-improvement things people could be doing. And games have always played an important role more widely. And I want to differentiate this a little bit here with the idea of play, of games as a more structured way of doing things. And the book that I wrote has a great debt to Nick and Greg with their Games of Empire, which was published 12 years ago or so now. And they argue that games have always served empire. From Cicero's claim that gladiatorial sports cultivated the martial virtues that Rome required, to the Duke of Wellington's apocryphal assertion that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, or the Prussian General Staff's Kriegspiel rehearsals for World War I Schlieffenplan. But games have also turned against empire in ways ranging from the bloodbath of Spartacus' revolt to the gentler revenges of the West Indian cricketers defeating their colonial British rulers, which of course in the last 12 years has happened over and over again in Britain as quite a kind of satisfying moment of seeing these games played out again. And so they have played a function both for capital, but also ways of finding resistance. And I will have to read this one out because the black highlighting has disappeared from my slides, which is a kind of, I must be down to Microsoft and the kind of PowerPoint formatting. But the idea that I wanted to get across with this is to think about how play and games often come as a separation from work. And thinking a bit about Kaiwa's work on surrealism and video games, to think about how games can be inserted as a moment against work at various points. When we play a game at work instead of doing the things we're meant to do. So thinking about different forms of resistance that games can play. Now, of course, Workers' Inquiry has much more to say about work than play. And I want to just say a little bit about my understanding of work and how it feeds into thinking about the video games industry. Work is, and I often joke with my students this, the thing that you're going to spend most of your life doing unless you're wildly wealthy or you have some get-rich-quick scheme or something else. That work is the activity that unfortunately we'll spend most of our time doing until we retire or die. And so it has a profound effect on shaping how we interact with the world, how we interact with each other. It structures our relationships to resources, to money, to power, and to capital. That for most of us, this is how we're going to interact with the world in one way or another. But also, it's how we meet our needs under capitalism. Unless you have small holdings and you grow food, you have to go to work to be able to afford to eat and so on. And this is, for me, an incredibly important point about work. That it's through work that society is made and constantly remade every day. To give you one example of this, and I know nothing of logistics in Brazil, so I won't attempt to give an example. In London, 80% of the food comes through a single dock warehouse facility just outside London. If the docks close, all the fresh food disappears in 2 days in the city, and within a week, there's no food in the city. And so the people who are unloading the docks, using the machinery, driving the trucks, have to do this every day to allow a city like London to function. If the tube drivers don't come to work, the city can't move. And so we often think about how big cities or bigger dynamics can feel too abstract and difficult to get our heads around. But if you think about all of the work you've relied on today in order to be here in this room, think of how many hundreds, if not thousands of people you've relied on. And if they were to choose not to do it, how quickly things would have to change. Which is a kind of old Marxist point, but I think it's an important one to return to. And so part of this is thinking, well, if we have this history of inquiry from Marx, a lot has changed since the 1880s when Marx was writing. We know, of course, that Marx played a lot of chess. He celebrated finishing the manuscript of Capital by having a game of chess. It's not clear whether he won or not. He, of course, never played any video games, right? This is, of course, Marx has nothing to say about video games. And so we need to think about, well, how do we update these ideas for today? And one of the projects that I'm involved in is a journal called Notes from Below, which has featured lots of writing from Brazil, particularly on food platform work. And it's a kind of political journal that tries to update Workers' Inquiry for today. And I want to run over the way we analyze doing writing with workers, or doing interviews with workers, or helping workers to write about their conditions, because this is the framework that shapes the analysis of Marx at the Arcade. The first is, if you want to understand work and workers' conditions, we need to talk to people about the technical composition of their work. Now, these are the kind of classical sociology of work, labor process features. Who do you work for? What do you do when you go to work? How are you managed? Who do you work with? Are algorithms used to manage you? All of these sorts of features, the kind of gritty details about work. And this is really how capital tries to organize a working class into work. So the ways that it tries to ensure that profit is made and production continues. The second part, and this is missing from a lot of the history of workers' inquiry, is that when the workday ends, workers do something until they come back for the next shift. There is a whole thing that happens, hopefully for longer than you're at work, about how people are organized into society. How is social reproduction handled? How is care organized? What kind of housing do people live in? What's their relationship to the state, to migration, to oppression? And the idea is that if we try to understand the technical composition of class, what's happening in the workplace, and what's happening in people's lives, the passage through these two kinds of composition shape the ways that people resist and organize. So to give you an example of this, think of how different the trade unions of academic workers are to steel workers or to coal miners. Think of how the details of our work shape the way we organize, shape the kinds of demands we make, and shape, and this is no comment on Brazilian trade unions, but shape how boring my union meetings are at home, because there are so many academics sitting around arguing about minor points rather than talking about politics, right? Because our day-to-day experience is about talking about minor points. So the idea here is not that you can move directly from a technical and social composition to say there must be this form of political composition. But understanding the first two helps us to make sense of the possibilities of the politics of this group of workers. Now, this kind of class composition is both asserted from the outside on workers, the way we work is pushed onto us, but then it's also shaped by the way that people push back on this work. So it is both a product and a producer of class struggle. It's something that is negotiated through struggle. So academics can change parts of their work, can change how they organize in different ways. But there is a kind of context set by the technical class composition. And so what I want to do now is to talk a little bit about how this applies to the video games industry. So if I've talked about the importance of class composition for making sense of these things, hopefully I have something to say about the technical composition of video game work. And I think there is a series of unique features of video game work. And I think one of the most important is looking at the longer history of video games and where they emerge from. Now, probably seeing that some people have read Games of Empire already, this won't come as a huge surprise. But there is a very long history and connection with the military-industrial complex and video games. The first video games were made by people who should have been working, plotting missile trajectories, calculating how many people would die from nuclear warheads and these kind of horrific tasks that American scientists were being asked to do, and instead found ways to play video games on these new machines, these new technological things that they were using. Now, there are various moments where the military sees the capability of computer simulation, that saw a use for these kind of things that people shouldn't have been doing at work. And then, of course, there are various moments where corporations and companies see the potential for selling these sorts of things. And so the early history of the video games industry is one of people hacking computers, making things for fun and enjoyment at work, and particularly so they don't have to do the thing that they're doing at work, and then it being recaptured. And so this kind of dialectic of control and resistance runs through the whole history of the video games industry. And so we don't really see the beginnings of a video game industry proper until the 1970s. And really, what's happening in the video games industry, and perhaps we have critiques of the concept of immaterial labor, and it would be interesting to hear some of those critiques in the discussion. But I still think Lazzarato, and particularly Italian workerism, if not post-workerism, I'm still a workerist rather than a post-workerist in many ways, I think has some interesting things to say about the growth of this kind of immaterial work. So the kinds of work that are involved in producing the informational and cultural content of commodities. And we see this kind of labor being valorized early on in the video games industry. Highly skilled computer programming, arts and visuals and sound technologies and so on. But I think one of the problems with thinking about the technical composition of a group of immaterial laborers or immaterial workers, people who are predominantly working on software, is we miss the material nature and material detail of this. And this isn't a particularly new point to make, but the video games industry is only possible because of complex networks of logistics, fiber optics, the mining of rare earth minerals, the production of video game consoles and peripherals and so on. And so what we start to see is a kind of a pyramid of different kinds of work in which at the top we increasingly find these less material forms of labor that are being encouraged in various ways. And particularly in Britain, this kind of work is encouraged because it's seen as being strategically important. The first computer programmers in Britain were all women. And after the Second World War, as Ma Hicks argues, women were entirely pushed out of the profession because it was seen as being both strategic for business and for military uses. So the work was regendered in Britain. And we see that through the early history of the video games industry. And I also want to tell a small personal story as well. My dad and my stepmom are both computer scientists. And I asked my dad at one point when I was writing this book, I said, you know, there are lots of examples of people working for the military and finding ways to hack the computers they were being given to play video games. My dad didn't work for the military, but he was a computer scientist. And I said, you know, did anything like this ever happen with you? And he spent a long time thinking about it. And then he said, yes, we did do this in the 70s. I said, all right, well, tell me what it was you did. And he said, well, we'd just been given access to this new computer, really advanced computer. And it was meant to be planning an industrial calendar for a factory. So making sure that the factory machinery was constantly in use. Again, a kind of classical Marxist issue, you know, ensuring that fixed capital is being used as often as possible. And he said it was really boring. They didn't want to do it. They'd been set this task as students. And so instead, they found a way to play a golf game, to make a golf game. It didn't look anything like the picture. Do you know what a dot matrix printer is? So it ran on a dot matrix printer, which kind of feeds the paper out, but can also pull the paper back in. And so it would kind of have this trajectory of the golf ball, and you had to hit a certain point on the page. It was noisy. It took a long time to play. Probably wasn't that fun. But they became really competitive, and they would play this game when they should have been doing their schoolwork, their university work. And so what I like about this example is, I think there is a huge lost history of people in the games industry and software development of mucking around with things, trying to do things because they're interesting or creative. And I think that helps to explain some of the things that happen in the video games industry today, that much longer history of resistance. And of course, we see this with the long history of modding of video games, and I'm sure many of us in the audience are familiar with this, that even some of the most successful conventional video games, in terms of numbers of sales and so on, are the result of people who made these because they were passionate about them, or they had an interest in them. So the classic examples are things like Counter-Strike, League of Legends and Dota before they were kind of commercialized, of the passion that people have for playing around with video games. That even today, we still see examples of this kind of creative output. Of course, these are versions that then people turned into commodities and sold for ginormous amounts of money. But they emerge not from that instinct. And so part of this is thinking about how the technical composition is shaped not only by the conventional forms of work in the video games industry, but also by the other forms of voluntarily given activities. So Tiziana Terranova talks about the early internet being brought to life through the contributions of unpaid work. I'm sure we're all come across some of these ideas before, and we can see this in the video games industry too, of how the blurring between paid and unpaid work brings video games to life. Think of any multiplayer game, how rubbish it is to play it on your own. I mean, you'll probably win if you're playing on your own, but it won't be much fun, right? That even other people's play can become an important component of this. And so often people have talked about this in terms of labor, this portmanteau of play and labor, of thinking about how this shapes people's experience of the work in one way or another. And I also just want to briefly say that the connections with the military-industrial complex haven't disappeared in the video games industry. And I think this is important to say because in the tech industry more widely, there have been a number of recent scandals about the use of contracts with government contractors in the US, of issues around control over work, of video game makers being asked to work on projects that they're not morally prepared to do so. And I want to give one example of this if you haven't heard of this before. So there is a very large gun called a Barrett 50 cal rifle. This is a gun that features in many video games. It's often the kind of big sniper rifle. If you want to feature this gun in your game, you have to contact Barrett. And Barrett have a specialist PR person who will meet with you. And they will give you a gun that you can go and shoot. And then they will talk to you about how they want the gun to be used. One of the things they say is it can only be used by the good guys, which they mean Americans, right? This is the kind of short version, maybe the British, maybe a couple of European countries, but mainly it's the Americans, right? Now, one of the problems with this is this gun is a real gun, and it's used by people in real conflicts. To give you an example of this, famously, the IRA had one of these guns, and they killed British soldiers with it. It was very effective. They killed a number of occupying soldiers in the north of Ireland. If you wanted to make a game about that conflict in the north of Ireland, you legally couldn't include that gun because it's being used to kill British soldiers. So there's this strange thing that happens where gun companies are directly interacting with video games culture. And I have a quote in the book from one of these PR people who says, we think this is really important because it's raising the next generation of gun owners. Now, there is no reason why a civilian needs a giant gun that can shoot through engine blocks of cars, but somehow there's an idea that advertising this to children is a good idea. But in part, I don't want to sound like a moralist who doesn't want to play games about video games with guns in them. It's that also some of these games then have licensing arrangements with gun companies. So if you buy a copy of Call of Duty, part of the money goes to Heckler & Koch, to these terrible arms companies who are actively involved in conflicts around the world. And that's quite different to many other forms of popular culture that feature violence. It's rare that you're actually directly funding an arms company. And so this shows how deeply these things are still shaped by the contact with the military. And so part of this is about shaping the experience of video game work. So think about how many people's work you have to rely on in order to turn on a video game console and log on and play an online game. There is a huge network of different forms of video game work. And one of the issues of thinking about the technical composition of this work is, where do we draw the boundaries around who is a game worker, who isn't a game worker? What do we consider to be the labor of the industry? And broadly speaking, this is an easier thing to answer in Britain, because we don't make much electronics in Britain. There are not many of these wider supply chains. But when I talk about game workers in the context of Britain, I'm predominantly talking about studios and the kind of production of the software of video games. But none of this is possible without those wider networks that go on beyond that. There is a particular feature of video game development work which has been a long-running issue in the industry, which is crunch time. Perhaps we've heard of this phenomenon before. Another way of talking about it is overwork. And some of the video game workers I know have gone through periods of crunch, working 70, 80, 90, 100 hours a week. And I want to give you one example of how this can be a mobilizing factor for thinking about changing the industry. So a game worker that I've known for many years in Britain, he's involved in the Game Workers Union, once told me a story about crunch, where he went through an intense period of crunch. It was about 3 months long. He regularly slept in the office. He missed family events, social events. He was in the office on his birthday, and he took 20 minutes to drink a beer and then went back to work as the clock turned midnight. So a really intense period of crunch. Then an exec walked into the studio and said, "We've decided this game's not going to make enough money, and we're canning it. So everyone stop work, take the weekend off, go and see your family, come back in on Monday morning and we'll get started on a new project." And he said he came back to work and spent 3 months just staring at the computer screen and thinking, why did I pour my life into this for someone I've never met to come in and say, this isn't worth doing. And so there's often a deep anger in the industry about crunch, but there's an expectation that because so many people have been through it, it's a feature of the work. That this is how video games have to get made. And in part, this is about the figure I showed you at the very beginning from Steam. If there are 77,000 games on Steam and you release a new game, you want to make sure it's ready in time for the holidays. You want to make sure it fits with the marketing schedule. You want it out before the competitor's game. That there is a huge pressure on when games are finished. And the problem is it's often very difficult to know when a game is finished. How long will it take to make? How long will it take to make it look acceptable and so on? That it's a real management problem. But it's also a classical issue that Marx would have been very familiar with. There are two ways to increase exploitation at work. One is to make people work harder, and one is to make people work longer. And if you're working 100 hours a week, you're working the same as 3 people. Although probably less, because when you work that much, it's difficult to work hard. But you're getting a huge gift of, theft from workers by making people work that long. And then we can think a little bit about how some of the practices of the video games industry, particularly around gamification, of thinking about how reward systems can be used for managing people, are bleeding out into other parts of the economy. Using point systems, encouraging food delivery workers, iFoods or other companies like this, to complete a certain number of tasks. That there are things being learned from video games that have a broader application. And then briefly, and we can talk about this a bit later on, we could also think about how gamification can play two uses. And this is about thinking about power. That if your gamification is introduced in your workplace, you have to take part in it to get those high scores, to show that you're performing and so on. But that often workers can have alternative uses for things like gamification, to find ways to play games at work, to resist some of these practices. And then the final point on technical composition is that a very large number of people in the industry are expected to sign non-disclosure agreements. And one of the things we found when organizing with video game workers was that often these would not stand up in court. They were not worth the paper they were written on. And they would often include clauses like you can't go and work for a competitor. So the use of the law in trying to discipline workers. To say you should be lucky to work here, and we'll ask you to sign all of these contractual clauses that will prevent you even talking to people about what game you're playing. And it's a very strange experience organizing with people who won't tell you where they work, won't tell you what game they're working on, because they're worried that they've signed these contracts that prevent them from doing that. The second thing, and I'll talk briefly about this, is the social composition of video game work. I think Graham Kirkpatrick has a very nice way of talking about the kinds of people who make video games. And he says the people who work in the games industry are invariably invested in gaming as a cultural practice. Games are made by gamers with all that implies. Lots of people dreamed of working in the industry. They got into debt to do degrees, they did internships, they gained experience. People who work in games want to work in the games industry. This is not true of many industries in contemporary capitalism. There are lots of places where people don't want to work. And if you want to work in an industry, it can open you up to much greater levels of exploitation. There are also a number of processes that have gendered the games industry in quite profound ways. And the example I always think about this is, why is Game Boy called Game Boy? There are a number of management choices about how to advertise video games that have set out to gender the games industry in one way or another. Crunch is also very closely tied to the gendering of the games industry. In Britain, if you are a woman working in any sector really, the likelihood that you're going to have to take on the burden of care work is much higher. If you have care work, it's very difficult to take part in crunch. So people are excluded from the industry. If there are less people with caring responsibilities, it's easier to do more crunch, which makes it even harder for people to enter in. And so there is a kind of interconnection between the gendering of the industry and crunch that is self-reinforcing. It also leads to high levels of burnout. The same game worker I'm talking about has worked in the games industry for 10 years, and he calls himself an old veteran of the industry because he's been around for 10 years. There are lots of industries where that would not make you a veteran. 10 years is still quite early in a career, right? Okay, the final point that I want to talk about is how this relates to the political composition of video game work. So I've been running a project with a video game worker, a few video game workers, trying to map all of the collective action in the video games industry. So where there have been strikes, protests, unions have been formed. This won't mean anything to you, this kind of calendar. But we played a competition to find the earliest example of collective action in the video games industry. Can you see the numbers on the board? Okay, I was going to ask you to guess, but if you can see them, you can already guess that it was 1955. There was a sit-down occupation of a Nintendo factory in Japan. Now, of course, this is slightly not correct because they were making playing cards at that time, not video games. But in a way, it's the earliest possible example of collective action in the games industry, even though it's earlier than the games industry itself. And what we see is a number of different peaks, well, tiny moments. In the 1980s, there were a wave of strikes in Atari factories that were making video game consoles. In Ireland, there was an occupation of a factory over redundancies, and workers won additional compensation. Then in the 90s, there were the beginnings of attempts to think about organizing more software developers in the games industry. People may be familiar with the EA Spouse scandal over crunch time. And then some early attempts to bring together groups of workers who were making video games. But these were all quite minor moments. Then in 2018, we have a huge peak in the amount of collective action in the industry, when a number of video game workers got together and went to a conference in the US, the Game Developers Conference, and tried to host a meeting on unionization. And this is in a way a textbook example of how not to manage a group of workers who want to organize at work. His managers went along and said, you don't need a union, unions are terrible, don't organize. And so of course everybody went away saying, organizing at work sounds like the best thing ever, because our managers don't want us to do it. And it caused a kind of global scandal in the industry. And at that point, I met some video game workers and started doing this project on organizing in the games industry. The website has a number of different actions. There's only one from Brazil, so if anybody has any other things to add about Brazil, we'd be very keen to take some submissions on it. But there have been around 131 solidarity actions. These are actions that involve more than one person around a workplace issue in the video games industry in which people did something about it. So it could be a petition, a strike, any form of collective action. And we can see that there's a kind of global spread. So there's a little bit in Latin America. There's lots in North America, in parts of Western Europe, China, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And what we've been asking video game workers to do is to submit their own actions and start trying to map out what's happening, what successes are being had, and what challenges different groups of workers are facing. In the past year, there have been a whole range of different solidarity actions, but the majority of these have happened in the US. In the US, there have been 13 different things that have happened in the video games industry. Then in Canada, there's been a few. In the UK, there's been one. Ireland, France, Croatia, and so on. And the overwhelming majority of these actions so far have been the formation of unions. So the past year, as really the first year coming out of COVID, has been marked by video game workers filing for union recognition in the US. Now, there have also been a couple of strikes. The video game journalists at Kotaku and others went on strike with the GMG union. Video game store workers in the US went on strike. And an esports team, an Overwatch esports team, went on strike during a competition. They refused to play because they thought their opponents were being unfairly treated by the competition, and they walked out. So there's a kind of interesting range of strikes that have happened. The one thing that I do think is worth saying about the journalist strikes is there's been a long history over the last 5 to 10 years of digital journalism organizing in North America. This means that the video games press is increasingly unionized. And so when they write about unions, strikes, and organizing, they're very sympathetic to it. They write about how unions are a good thing, how going on strike can get you more money. There are very few industries where the press that cover that industry are so keen on collective organizing. And this has really encouraged, I think, a shift change in how people in the games industry see organizing at work. But in part, this is shaped by the strangeness of the American industrial relations system. I think I broadly know how things work in Brazil in terms of joining a union. In Britain, if you want to join a trade union, you can join a union. You just pay your fee to the union and you join. Then if you want to go on strike, you have a vote, you go on strike. It's a very straightforward process. In the US, you can only join a union if a majority of people in the workplace want a union. Then you have a vote and a majority say they want a union. Then the union can be formed. So it's had to go shop by shop, studio by studio, having these union votes. So 14 union votes sounds like a huge amount, but it's actually only 14 small companies. One of them is a bit bigger. And so this shapes things in one way or another. And so part of the challenge that we're having with this part of the project is to think about, if you map things quantitatively, what can that tell us qualitatively about what's happening? So to give you an example of this, I was part of helping a union of video game workers form in Britain. This gets 1 point on the map for forming a union. It was a huge amount of work that involved hundreds of people. There are now many, many more people involved in the union. They meet regularly, they talk about politics, they try and organize at different workplaces. All of that happens underneath the surface. So we don't see that from the one union point. But what we're increasingly starting to see is a wave of unionization that began in 2018 that is now beginning to mature in different countries. In Britain, video game workers joined an independent union that has a history of organizing with cleaners and other precarious workers. In South Korea, workers have set up enterprise-level unions at companies and have had strikes and protests and are beginning to win things. In France, well, if you know anything about unions in France, there's one main union and then there are like 5 political unions that game workers can be a member of. They've been on strike at various points. It's unclear how many people are involved. Whereas in the US, workers decided to join a mainstream trade union, the Communication Workers of America, a very large trade union, and are starting to do this shop-by-shop organizing model. Now, what's not clear so far is which of these models will help workers in the video games industry to build their power and change conditions, win things. And so I think we're at a very exciting moment in the games industry. It's not often that 3 or 4 different models of organizing are tried all at once in different places. Usually people try a model, it fails, they try a new one, it fails, they find one that works. At the moment, we're seeing experimentation of a whole different set of approaches to what it means to organize at work. And the building of workers' power in the video games industry, and I'll begin wrapping up on this point, has the huge potential to reshape the working conditions of people in this industry. The games industry is one of the few industries that is growing, that grew during the pandemic, that is highly profitable. It is a place where you can win genuine, serious material gains if you're working in that industry, without having to reshape the business model of a studio or something like this. I also think it has huge potential for reshaping parts of video game culture. To give you an example of this, we had a video game worker in Britain who was sacked by her employer because she used the word feminist in her social media bio. And the community around the game said, we don't want a feminist working for this company. And so they harassed the company until this person was fired. Now, this is, of course, illegal in Britain. You get compensation for this. But if you're able to have the power to say no as a worker in that industry, to say video game companies have a responsibility to intervene in video game culture, to curate these communities, to stand up against some of the more toxic elements, it shows us a way out of some of the problematic parts of the culture, which otherwise would be very difficult to think about how you deal with this. And most video game workers don't want to make games for toxic cultures. They're forced to do that because these are seen as communities that will continue paying for products. So there is a kind of question of what workers' power could do more widely. And then I think very importantly, for the huge number of people that play video games, particularly for younger people, finding out that their games are made by workers who have rights at work, who can get pay rises, who can go on strike, who can organize collectively, is an incredibly important lesson for many people in other forms of work where there isn't collective organizing or collective power. One example that I like to daydream about, I don't know if you have this here in Brazil, but in the US and sometimes in the UK, if a newspaper is made by union labor, it gets a stamp that says made by union labor. Or clothes sometimes, okay. You could imagine this stamp on a video game. This video game was made by union labor, which we're beginning to see elements of companies saying, we're not going to crunch. We care about our work, sort of care about people who work for us. But you could imagine that this could become part of saying to a broader layer of people, you deserve better at work. And if video game workers can do it, why can't you? Okay, so to finish on another quote, and then I really will wrap up. Part of this is about trying to argue that Marxism can tell us something about the games industry and the direction that the games industry is going in. Ernest Mandel, a Belgian Marxist, has a great quote about why to write about culture. And if you're able to get hold of a copy of this book, it's a great book. He loved crime novels, and he wrote a book about crime novels called A Delightful Murder. And he said, to those who consider it frivolous for a Marxist to spend time analyzing crime stories, I can only offer this final apology. Historical materialism can and should be applied to all social phenomena. None is by nature less worthy of study than the others. The majesty of this theory and the proof of its validity lies precisely in its ability to explain them all. Whether it's really bad crime novels that were written in the 60s or video games today, I think Marxism still can tell us something about the games industry. It can tell us something about the power relations in the games industry, why the games industry is the way that it is, and what this tells us about capitalism more widely. Think of how early many of the phenomena that we find across the rest of the economy happens in the games industry. Platformization happens much earlier. The spread of global value chains in terms of production, video games as a commodity are kind of the globalized commodity, right? Think of how many people are used in the production process from different places. But I also think we can't forget about the other way around, that video games can tell us something about capitalism and can help us revive a Marxist theory for today. When I was first writing this book, a number of older Marxists said to me, why are you wasting your time doing this? You should be focusing on a proper question. And actually, as Mandel says, if we push our ideas out into the world with things that don't immediately make sense, like why do people play video games? Why do people watch people playing video games? Why is the industry organized in this way? Helps us to refresh a Marxism that can make sense of society much more widely. And I think that question of worker organizing is pivotal to this. Why did video game workers start organizing? Why not earlier? Why not later? How are they organizing in their industry? What can other people learn from this? Becomes a lesson we can take from these things. And much like how I started the beginning of this talk by saying the frustrating thing about writing about this is it keeps changing. In 6 months' time, there's going to be a whole load of new entries on the Game Worker Solidarity website, and that story is still being written. But I still think the first way that we understand this is the same way that we end the Assassin's Creed mission when we finish the tasks for Uncle Carl, is it ends by saying, follow Marx. And I think that's what we should do today. Thank you.
A gente vai fazer agora um rápido Q&A. Então, quem tiver perguntas, por favor. Se quiser, claro, com certeza.
Professor, can you listen to me? Okay. I'll try to make. I would like to know how you see, for example, more post-Marxist theories that don't see play and work as opposites, but are as a continuum, more like a Adorno's sense, for example. I'll try to give two quick examples. The first one, I'm thinking about, for example, what Kelly Cockcrack will say in her book about masculinity and the arcades, that the arcades are a preparation for the 80s people to start working in tech industries. That's what like girls' game movements will say in the 90s when they say that games don't really appease girls, so that's why they can't give this a jump to enter the technology industries, and that's what makes the gender gap in this industry. So how you look at it in a more like ideological way. How these, for example, play mainly in the arcade, but today also in like more online games, for example, in this like ideology of like competition, etc. For one thing, to think about how these ideologies on the modern gaming will translate in like the work industry, and the other thing, it's more like. I'll be honest with you, I do think you talk about this in Marx and Arcades, but I can't really remember, but how casual gaming, for example, in workspaces makes you look naughty and you think, oh, I'm really not doing work at all, I'm playing, but what you're doing is like playing a little bit and then you go back to work and you don't like socialize with other workers, etc. And so how do you see this work-play continuum not as opposites?
Other questions?
Yeah, I can do this. Yeah, whatever. So, yeah, to be careful how I answer this, because I think there is a bit of a linguistic specificity when I say work. So when I talk about work, I mean the capitalist relation of work, which for me is a very specific and unique feature of capitalism, as opposed to labor as a broader activity. And so I think there's a lot of crossover between play and labor. I have gone cold turkey from Destiny 2. And I think a lot of that is labor rather than play. That moment where you find yourself writing out to-do lists is like, that's the moment I decided I had to go cold turkey. This is no longer fun. You know, this is just doing labor. But I do think there is a political importance in the work relationship specifically that I think is different to labor, different to other forms of labor around work, is that the work relationship is where we as workers confront capital in its most kind of pivotal moment. It's where we're exploited, it's where value is produced, and it's where we have the power to fight back and do something different. And this is one of the challenges with other forms of labor that are increasingly becoming like work, is not going on Facebook is not the same as going on strike. This is a different relationship. And I think Nick Dyer-Witherford summarizes this really well. The labor of people in software development studios is work. The work of people in factories making iPhones is work. But having to go on Facebook to maintain our social contacts is just another thing that capitalism does to try and rip us off, to steal our data, to do these things. But it's a different relationship. And often we end up with multiple levels of rent seeking and so on. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Perguntar em português para o pessoal entender, você traduz ou vou direto? Bom dia. Eu vou perguntar em português para ficar mais fácil para todo mundo, depois o Thiago faz a tradução. Né? Bom, eu queria perguntar, James, se você acha que esses jogos, às vezes considerados news games ou jogos políticos, como Phone Story, McDonald's Game, até mesmo jogos como Papers, Please, se eles alcançam os objetivos, né, pelos quais os desenvolvedores criaram esses jogos, que é, né, de uma certa forma, criar uma consciência, né, acerca dos temas que eles estão trabalhando, ou você acha que não, ou alguma outra coisa?
I have lots of views on this. I think there are two kinds of political games, and I don't know whether this translates, so I'll try, and if it doesn't make sense. Big P political games, so like games that tell you they're about politics, and then political games, games that have politics in them. And I think there's a use for both. The problem with big political games is people play them who already agree with the politics. And they enjoy them, and they seek them out, and they play them. I'm much more interested in games that have a politics to them. To give you one example of this, the Financial Times published a game about Uber. This is a fantastic political game because it doesn't say Uber are terrible, but it asks you to try and be an Uber driver, and you can't make any money in San Francisco. You end up in debt, and it's the Financial Times, not known for its left-wing readership more widely. And so it can play this kind of agit-prop role. Whereas on the other hand, you know, I love a political game, you know, Mole Industria and so on. These games are fun, but they play a different role more widely. And I guess what I find interesting is how many political themes are entering into games much more widely. You know, think of Disco Elysium, Shipbreaker, you know, the number of these games that have very political themes, but don't put it at the top. And I think that's much more interesting, that the politics is maturing in the industry.
Thiago, may I? Posso só complemento? Just, agora eu vou perguntar em inglês. Just for example, as I mentioned, these games like McDonald's game, that you have to, you can't win if you don't act not kindly with your workers, or like the phone story that you have to point your gun to the kids that are farming those electronic components. Do you think that this kind of game can create a certain awareness on the players, or most players just will play and never be aware of what the game is trying to persuade?
Yeah, I mean, I think Paolo's work with Molo Industria, I think, is fantastic. And yeah, we interviewed him for a project a while back, and I think he does really, really interesting things, and I think has pushed forward this idea of political games in lots of ways. I use these games with my students. How to build a better mousetrap has helped me to explain the labor theory of value to many students, because if I stand at the front and start talking about the labor theory of value, not everyone pays attention, right? Whereas if you get them to play through this abstract game, you can talk about the ideas. And so I think there's a real potential with them. It's just we also in Britain have a number of games that I don't think do this. So there was one made for Jeremy Corbyn's election that nobody who didn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn would ever have played this game. I think it's a bit too on the nose. So we should be, a bit subtler about these things, I think.
Hi, Dr. Woodcock. I'm Nilson Soares from Cesar School. And one thing I perceive in the games that I find very interesting and maybe deserving some research, I don't know if there is something about it, is that most games, I believe most games, they are about a hero's journey. So it's up to the player, it's up to his avatar to solve all the problems in the world. In these games, the state is either absent or incompetent or corrupt. So it's up to the player to take on his own hands and to solve everything. That's kind of like the Batman or the cowboy would do. It's my intuition that maybe this kind of view being pushed to the players in most games and most AAA games is kind of incentivizing a vision of the world where the anarcho-capitalism or the neoliberalism is kind of imprinted on these players, where they will believe, they will transpond, oh, you cannot trust the government. The government is incompetent, is corrupt, is absent. You have to take the matter into your own hands. And maybe this kind of narrative where the player is always the hero trying to save the world, most times circumventing the law and infringing other things like the Assassin's Creed where you kill the guards and you invade some space, where taking that as a solution to solve the world's problems. So you ignore the law, you ignore the society, and you solve it like a cowboy. How do you view those things, and do you think this really may impact some of the players?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I mean, I also think it's specific to certain kinds of games, because there are lots of kinds of games that don't have the hero narrative. Instead, they have the God's eye view from above, which is a whole different problem, right? And I think in part, the kind of culture that we have already produces the kinds of video games that we get. And so it's no surprise that many games talk about, you know, an individual approach to these problems. The hero goes around and saves the world in various ways, usually making a lot of money while they do it. You know, this is part of that narrative. But I also think there are plenty of different ways to engage with some of those stories. I want to give you one example of this. There's a political game that's played in Britain amongst a certain section of the left, where they go through the game you play through a political struggle, and everyone wants to play the left. So they fight over who gets to play the different left groups. It's much more interesting to play the right. That if you play the right and think about what strategies they use in this political crisis, you learn something new from it. Is that we should never think that you have to agree with the politics of the game to play it. We can play it in different kinds of ways. And for me also, what's exciting about the organizing in the games industry is all the video game workers I meet talk about the game they would love to make. And it's not a hero's journey. It's not a shooting game. It's some bizarre, creative thing that they've dreamt up that they want to be able to make. That more workers' power in the industry will lead to more interesting and creative games because the people who make them get a say in them.
Thank you.
Hey, Jamie. Hope you're having a nice time here. I have actually a question, not a question, but more a commentary out of what Emmanuel said. So there's this article on Kotaku that says that Victoria 3 players think communism is too OP versus capitalism. You've heard this? I just wanted you to say something about it because I think it's really curious because Victoria 3 is like a quite liberal game. You know, it has a quite liberal point of view, but they did it. I think it was like accidental, and I think people were like asking for them to patch to make this more less overpowered. You know, I wanted you to briefly talk a little bit about it, if you could.
Yeah, I think this is a very funny example. If people don't know this game, it's a kind of city building game. And one of the options, you know, if you give more resource to workers and you support them with policies, you take a communist route, you outperform any other political choice in the game. And I can't help but feel some of the developers, who it's worth saying are unionized, they've been part of a wave of unionization, are trolling the community slightly. Because the reality is a more egalitarian, democratic way of organizing work where people have control and have power over their work is better. So it's true. The weird thing is, and this is where it ties in a bit with your comment, is then why is the player still needed? So there's this kind of irony of, you can introduce a left-wing policy, but then the player is still deciding everything that happens. So these things are always within limitations, right? But it's inevitably better than Civilization, which is one of my long-term favorites, where the communist policy is always like cheaper tanks and, kind of horrible things like that. And I think in a way this is the kind of, the contradiction of video game play is individual games are always going to be about what the individual can do in that game. And this is a problem that goes back to the bourgeois novel, right? Like, this is a problem of how to introduce collective themes, collective action, collective practice in something that is ultimately an individual pursuit. And there have been I'd love to see an experimentation like Nanni Balestrini's novels in Italy, where he tries to write from a collective viewpoint, or does these experimental forms of literature in a video game. I just have no idea what it looks like, but it's an exciting idea, right?
So, Jamie, thank you a lot for your talk. And the most interesting thing for me is to try to compare the vision about, for example, working in factories. You talked a lot about examples dealing with this kind of work that the space contributes for the organization in a kind of way, right? And the interesting thing to me is to compare this to Brazilian context, because if you think about how games are used to generate value in Brazil, and our research group is working in this hypothesis, maybe the best example is hope labor and a kind of very informal and scattered work, for example, in esports teams that try to get prizes and build a social media following, and that kind of work is very, very different from the factory work and even the gaming industry work, where you still have a space where you live along with your fellow workers, right? And people really understand themselves as workers. So my question is, how do you see Marxism? Does it still help us understand this kind of scenario where people don't think they are working and they are hoping for someday try to develop themselves to live from playing games in a very scattered manner? Because these teams, for example, Free Fire is a game very popular in Brazil. The teams are for maybe 6-7 people, so that it even doesn't make too much sense to see them as a collective thing, right? In strikes and all this vocabulary of the old kind of jobs, right? So my question is, does Marxism still help us in this scenario?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I mean, I think in some ways it does, right? Because I meet lots of young people who say, I want to play video games, I don't want to go to work. Now that says something about the kinds of work that they're otherwise going to go into. And that question of consent and hegemony around work is and I can't speak about Brazil, but in Britain, most young people's prospects is precarious work, it's low paid in the context of Britain, it's insecure, the housing contracts will be short, the house will be bad quality. Of course, people want to play video games and maybe get a huge salary, win a big prize, because they no longer see work as a way to do that. Whereas previous generations work hard, get promoted, get a pension, like that has disappeared for people. And I think part of the problem with this as a route is it's an individual route to success. It's about saying, I'm not going to organize at work. Instead, I'm going to try and get good enough at this thing that I will be the one who gets out of it. But I think what we shouldn't do is say to people, this is wrong. that you're trying to do this. Like, everybody deserves a better life, right? Instead, what we have to say to people is, if you don't make it, which you won't, because most people are not going to, like, what do you do next? Like, do you go into work and try and organize? Do you try and get involved in a campaign or something like this? And have those conversations with people. Because the reality with esports and streaming is there's a huge pyramid with a tiny fraction at the top who ever make enough money not to work. But it requires all those people below it. Much like professional sports did for hundreds of years, right? Yeah, it's a kind of new refiguration of this. But I think what we should think about is the politics of what this means. And there is a deep-seated rejection of work amongst a lot of people, which could be turned into something collective. It just isn't at the moment, right?
On that, but how do we, I mean, shed light onto this problem to these people when the game is rigged, the company is rigged? Because I was thinking about what you said concerning the relationship between labor and play, and how you dropped Destiny 2 because you felt you were working for that, and a great deal of the contemporary experience of video games is labor today. I play trading card games, and for example, if I stop reading articles and checking the metagame for a week, the next tournament I'll be shit. So how do we turn that wheel? I think that's the question. I mean, practically, but not in the side of the workers, but how do I make people who plays with me, for example, to understand that is not a good thing. They're not in a good place there. So that's it.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I mean, I'm always struck by the amazing creative things that people choose to do when they're not working. Like, people have like huge capabilities and they get interested in the tiniest things and spend so much effort on it and so on. Is imagine what people would do if they weren't having to go to work. This idea that we wouldn't do anything if we didn't have to go to work is a kind of, for me, like a nonsense, right? But I think it's a very difficult question for thinking about, like, how you turn from these individual activities into something more collective. And this, I guess, is the point I was trying to make about organizing in the games industry more widely, is if people see video game workers organizing, if they see their food delivery workers organizing, their academic staff at the university they go to, their school teachers when they're students, it starts to undercut that idea that we can only win on our own. Now, the problem is, on our own, none of us can solve this problem because it's a collective problem, right? But we are, and I don't know whether this is happening in Brazil, but in North America, in Britain, in parts of Western Europe, there is a wave of new worker organizing happening. Starbucks baristas starting unions and going on strike. Amazon warehouse workers, couriers, whole new areas of the economy where people didn't have unions are starting to do them again. And this is a moment of potential collective change. I guess the issue is always one of then how we bring our politics to the things we do. Like, how do you talk politics about trading card games or Destiny? And I think that's the kind of challenge for Marxists, right? Is we should have something to say about these things. And this was always what I found so weird before writing this book, is other than Nick and Greg's book, there's so little from the left about video games and about these kinds of culture, is we should intervene everywhere, right? At work, in our communities, in our, in game spaces, to talk about a better vision for the future. And I don't know how to do that with trading card games because I don't really understand them. But, it's beginning to talk about the power relationships, why are the companies structured in the way that they are, the tournaments and so on, It's like starting to ask those questions is the beginning, right?
Hi, my name is Devi, and I wanted to ask you about a little bit of a female version of everything you're saying. And for that, I'm going to tell you a short story of myself. As a little girl, I used to play on a website called Girls Go Games. And in this website, there was a game that I used to play like all day long. That the goal of this game was for you to work, and with the money you get from this work, you buy clothes. And the alert that has on the game is that, oh, you have a sale, so you have to run from your work to get there in just a few minutes and get the clothes that are in promotion, are in sale. So what I wanted to understand is the difference narrative, because I don't have this experience of guns and all those things in video games, and I think many women don't have this experience, but and we have this difference, like we are the capitalism on girls games is usually attached to the fact that we need to buy things. And other games, like there was a game that we need to take care of babies in a hospital. There were games that, and I used to play all those games as an infant. And there was another game that we need to like buy clothes and dress ourselves to dates with men. So I want to understand your vision about this and this type of consumerism for women. And well, as I said, the goal of the game was to work to buy clothes. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really important point because my experience of games is a gendered one too, right? I also think it's really important to think about the games that are talked about in the media are not the games necessarily that are the popular or widespread ones. In Britain, the average demographic of a video game player is a middle-aged woman. She's likely to play more games than other people. She's likely to spend more on games, but she doesn't play the kind of games that the media talk about, Call of Duty. It's Candy Crush. You know, it's casual games, it's mobile games. But many people in the games industry don't, that's not a proper game, right? There's this sense of this. But what we found is lots of the video game workers that we organize with in Britain, they work on these huge mobile games I've never heard of. And a lot of them are targeted at teenage girls. And the clothes thing is still a big part of this because then it's microtransactions for clothes. And so one of these people I spoke to, he spends his day figuring out ways to sell things to teenage girls, which is not what he thought he would do when he worked in the video games industry. But we do have to broaden out our understanding of games and to think about selling guns is one problematic feature. There are, of course, many others. The preparing for dates is like pure ideology, right? This is pushing ideology onto people on games. But again, is to think about what other kinds of games could be played and could be made, because there's no reason why teenage boys should play with guns and then talk about dressing up their characters. They call it armor, not clothes, but it's the same thing, right? It's a similar dynamic. There's no reason why these things have to be this way, but the games industry is such a classic example of gendering of cultural production, right?
Gente, temos tempo para mais uma pergunta, tá? Infelizmente, estou vendo que o pessoal criou coragem só agora. A gente tem 5 minutos só no auditório. Não, que isso. Aí a gente, se vocês conseguirem ser muito rápidos, I'm just saying that we have only 5 minutes. I will try to squeeze 2 questions, quick questions.
Bom dia, meu nome é Malu. Eu gostaria de saber o que você sente vendo que o jogo, né, que a gente vê como uma atividade livre, podemos dizer assim, tem se tornado também um trabalho. A gente vê times de esportes, né, que já foi comentado aí, surgindo, e essa atividade deixando, entre aspas, né, de ser livre para virar uma atividade para gerar dinheiro para o jogador.
So I'll make the two questions in a block.
Sorry, I don't speak English. Eu queria poder falar um pouquinho sobre dinâmicas raciais envolvendo o jogo também. Porque eu vejo que envolve uma questão muito grande aqui, principalmente no Brasil. E eu queria saber a questão de Londres, como que é. Porque a gente acaba tendo várias barreiras aqui, em questão de raça mesmo. A gente acaba tendo uma dificuldade no acesso de jogos, tanto por tempo, porque a gente acaba tendo menos tempo disponível, tanto por dificuldade da linguagem mesmo, a gente acaba não sabendo inglês. Eu não sei inglês, eu não entendi nada que foi falado aqui. E até uma questão de dinheiro mesmo. Enquanto o pessoal os brancos estão jogando Last of Us 1 e 2, eu estou jogando Free Fire, no meu tempo livre do trabalho. E essa é a realidade do Brasil. Eu queria saber um pouquinho mais sobre a realidade de Londres, como que funciona lá e se tem alguma solução possível para isso.
So the first question was asking you, she asked you, what do you think about the process of games turning from a free activity to a labored one? I don't know if this word exists. And how do you feel? And she gave the example of esports too. That's originally a competitive, fun activity turning into a kind of job, even for people that don't make money with it. And the second question is about the racial dynamics. Especially, he said that he's from Brazil, that he plays Free Fire while most white gamers in Brazil, middle-class people, play The Last of Us, and he's playing games like Free Fire, for example, which is a mobile game, an e-sport mobile game. And how do you see the racial dynamics in this question? And he also is curious about how do you view that in London, in your context, if it's like that, how are the local components in London?
Yeah, they're really great questions. I'll try and be brief in my responses. The first thing is I spent some time interviewing Twitch streamers, and I would always ask them one question, which I found really amusing, which was, what game do you play to relax? Thinking nobody would say they play games to relax after 12 hours of streaming. And every single person had a game that they wanted to play after they finished working playing a game. And what I think is useful about Marxism for this question is unpicking the economic relationships behind play and understanding what happens when play becomes work. And for me, this is the thing about Destiny 2, is when I start to feel like I'm being tricked to spend longer playing on it, to get another dopamine hit, then for me it's too much like work and I want to step away from it. If you're an esports player, you can't do that because it becomes your work. So you have to do it. So these are kind of interesting dynamics. I guess the other thing to answer the question on race, again, I think this is a very important question. The games industry in Britain is overwhelmingly white and British, and this reflects the demography of the country. It's much more male, and so there are a number of these issues of diversity within the games industry itself. Then in terms of the play of video games, it's more similar to North America, that young black gamers in London for a long time grew up playing in arcades. There are particular kinds of music that grew out of the neighborhoods that people lived in where they played in arcades. So early grime, forms of British hip hop, is very tied to arcade culture in Britain. Whereas young white people in general would play games in the home on PC or console. But I would say this is about race, but it's also about class. It's about access to video games. If you grow up playing arcade machines, it's much harder to enter into the industry than if you grew up with a computer, modding things, experimenting with them. And this is one of the reasons why diversity is such a challenge in the industry, because of these racializations, gendering, and kind of class barriers to the industry.
Bom, deixa eu dar uma traduzida e resumida também, rápida. Para a primeira pergunta, ele te respondeu sobre um questionário que ele fez com streamers da Twitch, perguntando qual jogo, e se é que eles jogam algum jogo para se divertir, para relaxar. E a hipótese dele é que as pessoas iam falar, não jogo nada porque eu fico trabalhando com isso o dia inteiro, eu quero fazer outra coisa. E ele falou que não, que as pessoas de fato ainda jogam jogos semelhantes, né? E ele atribuiu ou percebeu essa correlação com algo parecido com o que você falou, que é a própria estrutura dos jogos tem um ciclo que parece um pouco com o incentivo ao trabalho, né? De mecanismos de recompensa e incentivo e etc., né? Que faz você querer jogar um pouco mais, mesmo que não seja para relaxar, e sim para, por exemplo, completar uma barrinha de evolução, né? E sobre a sua pergunta, ele falou até um cenário que me parece semelhante ao que você colocou, né? Sobre como em Londres, por exemplo, existe uma divisão de raça, de jovens negros jogando mais jogos de arcade, né? Fliperama, e a classe média branca jogando em casa jogos de console, videogames, como você falou, né? The Last of Us. Ele chamou atenção para o fato de que isso também tem esse componente de raça, mas é o componente de classe interagindo, né? E aí acho que é isso, né? Ele falou, comparou também com o cenário da América do Norte, né? Que é talvez essa proporção de gente que joga os jogos mais mainstream, de console, caseiro, é maior do que aqui, mas existe também essa divisão. Então é isso, gente. A gente vai encerrar por aqui. Às 2 a gente retorna, deixa eu falar direito o nome das sessões. É a sessão de jogos, gênero e narrativa, se eu não me engano. Deixa eu só ver aqui. Às 2 horas, né? A gente tem um almoço até às 2. Então a gente tem às 2 horas lá no Mídia, tá? A sessão temática de jogo e educação. Depois e vão ser concomitantes, né? Numa outra sala vai estar acontecendo a sessão. Espera aí que eu falei do dia 7. Às 2 horas. Então, hoje, dia 6 de março, jogo, gênero e poder em uma sala, e na outra sala a sessão mídia, representação e políticas do jogo, tá? E as outras depois vocês olham a programação.
Gente, eu queria agradecer a presença de todos vocês aqui. I'd like also to thank you, Jamie, for coming here. E a gente se vê durante o evento. Muito obrigado.